Welcome to Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. I'm absolutely thrilled to have one of the world's leading experts on international relations and one of the most important voices in public affairs in the world today with me, Professor John Mearsheimer, also a good friend and somebody that I admire tremendously. Professor Mearsheimer has a very important new book, co-authored with Sebastian Rosado, who is a professor at University of Notre Dame, and Professor Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor at the University of Chicago. I'm sure that most or all of you have been listening to John Mearsheimer discuss the events around the war in Ukraine and now wars in the Middle East and so many other issues, because he's been the go-to person for so much of the world in trying to make sense of the multiple crises that we're in and the spread of violence. One of John's truly justifiably famous books is The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which was written at the start of the new century. And in that book, he said that it seems a little quiet now, but don't worry, or worry maybe I should say, great power politics will return. And the book's title that I'm going to discuss with you, John, also is about the tragedy of great power politics, and we seem to have a lot of tragedy to go around right now. But the new book that you've written is, of course, completely relevant for our current struggles and trials and tribulations globally. It's about how states think, and the gist of the book is about whether state decision-making is rational or irrational and what difference it makes. You started writing this during COVID, during the lockdown, so this is a book that you and Sebastian Rosado wrote, as I understand it, largely on Zoom together during the first couple of years of the pandemic, but it became absolutely pressingly relevant in trying to understand the Ukraine war. So maybe if we could start, you could explain the motivation for this book. You're known as our nation's leading realist thinker in international relations, so it would be good to help listeners understand how you fit into the story and your views about this. But what's the motivation of writing a book called How States Think?
Well, there is a widespread perception in the academic world and in the policy world that states, in terms of their foreign policy behavior, are irrational or non-rational. And our view was that if that is the case, most of our theories in international relations about how the world works are largely irrelevant, because all of those theories are based on the rational actor assumption. Then we also said to ourselves that if you're a policymaker and you think that states are irrational, how can you possibly formulate some sort of coherent policy? Because you have no idea what other states are going to do, because they're basically irrational. They're wild and crazy. And our intuition, in fact, our theories about how the world works, say that states are rational. So what we decided to do was try to figure out whether states are routinely rational or routinely non-rational. And to do that, you have to have a definition of what rationality is, because that has to be the baseline that you then employ to look at past state behavior and determine whether or not states have been rational or not. So what we do in the book is we explore what rationality is, and then we look at the historical record, and we conclude, one might say unsurprisingly, that states are rational most of the time. This is not to say that they don't do irrational things, and a good example of that would be George W. Bush invasion of Iraq in 2003. That was clearly, in our opinion, a case of non-rationality.
So we'll come to that to understand that. But in our current discourse, for example, it has been said almost nonstop. Well, Putin, he's irrational. He thinks he's Peter the Great. He's aiming in an illusion to rebuild the Russian Empire. And your argument is, no, this is not a serious way to think about Russia's decision-making or President Putin's role in Russia's decision-making. And if we think that way, we're ourselves going to be led down a very dangerous and inaccurate path in how we deal with the global challenges.
Yeah, let me say a few words about Putin, because there's no question that that's the case that almost everybody rivets on these days. Our basic argument is that whether a state is rational or not is largely a function of the theories that underpin the policy that a leader is pursuing. And in other words, if a statesman or a leader has a cockamamie theory that informs the state's policy, then that's not rational. And if you look at the case of Vladimir Putin, this is a pretty straightforward case of Putin and virtually every Russian leader being deeply fearful of NATO expansion. And when it was first announced in April 2008 that Ukraine was going to become part of NATO, the Russians made it unequivocally clear that this was unacceptable, and Putin was in the lead in making that argument. Nevertheless, NATO continued to move eastward and to attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. And the end result is a major crisis broke out in February 2014, and then you had the war where Putin or the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. And our argument is that this is a straightforward case of balance of power politics. It's Realpolitik 101. What Putin was doing was balancing against the West. He was balancing against NATO. It's hardly surprising that this conflict has broken out. But many people who are in the war party, and of course this includes huge numbers of people in the foreign policy establishment, believe that he is a mindless imperialist, and anybody who would dare to invade Ukraine for purposes of conquering it and incorporating it into a greater Russia has to be irrational. But that's not what he was doing, right? What he was doing was balancing against NATO. And this is a perfectly rational strategy. And we should have understood that from the get-go. And the fact that we didn't is quite remarkable.
And one of the pieces of evidence strongly in favor of your view is the memo that William Burns wrote in 2008 from his position as then ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's now the CIA director, but he wrote a memo back to the Secretary of State explaining it's not just Putin against the NATO expansion to Ukraine. It's the entire Russian political class. And so it's a complete opposite to the kind of claim that's made that there's some delusional leader. Burns spelled it out very clearly in I think the memo's entitled, "Niet means niet, no means no." Now, interestingly, John, just to ask you about that memo would never have seen the light of day, most likely, but for WikiLeaks. It was leaked in part of a treasure trove of foreign policy documents. So much of what states do, especially the U.S., I would say, and other big powers, is secret. So how does one assess the real decision making, what people really believe, and how states are acting?
Well, the truth is that it's very tricky to do uh, in real time. And when you talk about Putin and exactly what his thinking was, it is not easy to put your finger on exactly what is going on. It's much easier to look at historical cases where you have a rich record and you can see what the documents and the memoirs and so forth and so on say about a particular set of leaders and what they were thinking. But I would argue in the Russian case, it's a pretty straightforward instance of a leader and his lieutenants, apropos the Bill Burns memo, saying over and over how they thought about NATO expansion and what they were going to do. There's no mystery here.
It wasn't subtle.
No, it's actually quite remarkable. What's remarkable is that the West paid hardly any attention. Maybe should say no attention to what Putin and his lieutenants were saying. They completely ignored the Bill Burns memo. And I would imagine that once we get our hands on the historical documents, all the historical documents, we'll see that Burns was not the only one who was telling people at the top of the Bush administration that this was what was going to happen.
So it does seem to me that Russia's response to this relentless push of NATO or of the U.S. to have NATO, a U.S.-led military alliance, expand was rational. But maybe to get to that, if you could explain what you and Sebastian Rosado mean by the term rational, because it is a loaded or a debated and unclear term. How do you operationalize that? And since we're talking also not about an individual decision or an individual person who could be rational or delusional and so forth, but rather a state, what is a state in this context specifically? And how would you assess whether the state is acting in a rational way?
Yeah, this is a great question. Let me just quickly lay out my definition, or my and Sebastian's definition of rationality, and then answer your question head on. Our argument is that rationality has two dimensions to it. First is the individual, and then there's the collectivity or the state, because as you point out, you can't just focus on one individual, because decisions are made by a handful of people. There's surely a leader like Putin, but Putin is surrounded by other people who have input. So it's a collective decision or a state decision. And our argument is that at the individual level, what's imperative for rationality is for individuals to have a credible theory about how the world works that underpins their view of policy. We believe that human beings are fundamentally theoretical animals. We call this Homo theoreticus.
I like that, by the way. Yes.
Right. And that when you, Jeff Sachs, think about, what economic policy should be in Washington, you think about the world as an individual in terms of theories about how the world works. You have these economic theories. And when you look at international relations, you have political theories that inform your thinking. But that's just the individual level. Then there's the collective level, right? And our argument is you're often going to run into situations where you have different individuals who have different theories and therefore favor different policies. And to get a collective decision, to get a state policy, what you have to do in our story is have a deliberative decision-making process. You can't have a process that looks like the one before the Iraq War, where Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld suppressed all sorts of conflicting views or views that they didn't like. You have to have a robust and coherent decision-making process. And we argue in the Russian case that that's what happened. As you know, the conventional wisdom in the West is that Putin was isolated and that he made this decision to invade Ukraine all by himself. And there were all these people who disagreed with him, but he exiled them or he didn't listen to them. And it's the fact that he was a lone ranger that makes this irrational. This is wrong, we believe. And in fact, to go back to the Bill Burns memo, the Bill Burns memo makes it clear that Putin was not a loner here, that virtually everybody at the top of the foreign policy establishment in Russia agreed with Putin about NATO expansion. So our argument is, at the individual level, what you had is a set of Russian leaders, including Putin, of course, who were operating on the basis of balance of power theory, right? And therefore had a credible policy, right? And at the collective level, they agreed on what had to be done to deal with the problem. They believed to a person, I think, that, and the Bill Burns memo confirms this, that NATO expansion into Ukraine had to be stopped. And the end result is that on February 24th, 2022, we got a war.
And, I think one of the telling documents, again, that really supports your view is the readout or even it's almost verbatim minutes of the Russian Security Council meeting. I think it's February 21st, 2022. Is that right? Yes. That basically it's a very organized meeting, and President Putin lays out the issue. What shall we do, colleagues? And then he calls on Lavrov, the foreign minister, and then he calls on other experts. Then he calls on people from the regions. And you get a full readout. We very rarely get that from the United States documents because these things are kept secret. I think the Russians wanted this to be understood. But it's actually a very orderly deliberation, and it obviously reflects a lot of orderly processes that repeated it. It's not one person. It's not President Putin pounding the table and say, we must do this. Quite the contrary. Lavrov explains, we made this entreaty to, this approach to the U.S., but they sent back a document on such and such date saying they would not negotiate over NATO, and then the next one gives another answer, the next one gives another answer, and then the meeting is summed up by the president. But it's a very deliberative, orderly process that no doubt you get the feel reflects a lot of orderly attention to high-stakes issues, but actually through a deliberative process.
Jeff, can I just jump in here and reflect on one of the insights from our book? A lot of people believe that when it comes to collective decision making, when you're at the state level, there's a difference between how authoritarian states and democracies operate. And almost everybody we talk to in the West believes that democracies believe in deliberation. But authoritarian states are the opposite. And what you have is one leader who runs roughshod over everybody else. And this, of course, fits with the conventional wisdom on Putin. He doesn't listen to anybody. He decides what to do. And then anybody who disagrees gets sent to the gulag, and anybody who agrees gets promoted. So you have all these yes men and yes women who are operating under him. This is the way many people in the West think. Our view in looking at all these cases, and we looked at 14 cases in great detail, is that there's no difference between authoritarian states and democracies. In both cases, both sets of cases, you get a small number of people at the very top who make collective decisions. And what you discover in almost every case is when people are trying to formulate policies about grand strategy or how to deal with a particular crisis, what you see is that nobody, including the leader, is really sure what to do. And they're kind of searching around in the dark, trying to figure out what the best policy is. Therefore, leaders are prone to listen to their lieutenants about what might be a really good idea. If you take Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel today, whatever you think of Benjamin Netanyahu, he is in real trouble. The Israelis are in real trouble, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with Hamas. I am absolutely certain that Netanyahu is listening to anybody who he thinks might have a good idea about how to proceed. And someone like Naftali Bennett, who he might have terrible relations with otherwise, is a very smart man. And I'm sure that someone like Netanyahu will listen to Bennett just because Netanyahu is not sure what to do. And if Bennett has a good idea, he'll take that good idea and run with it. So my bottom line here is I don't think that Putin's behavior is any different in this authoritarian state, which Russia is, than would be the case if Russia were a democracy. You, in each case, have a small number of people at the top who make decisions and have a vested interest across the board in listening to others' ideas.
I think, that really comports with my perception also of China, which is very institutionalized, very bureaucratic. It's been an administrative state for 2,000 years with a lot of discussion, a lot of deliberation, not one person calling any shots at all, but actually really collective decision making in exactly that way. And I wonder, in a way, there is an irony that sometimes happens in our democracy. I have a feeling, let me ask you about this, many of the decisions that are taken absolutely against or with no interest in American public opinion, though in our self-assessment, democracy also means reflecting the will of the people. But on many of these issues, the people are not asked, they're told, or they're ignored. But often it happens that to get some decision made in foreign policy in our ostensibly public-driven process, the public is lied to. Lied to about the real situation on the battlefield, or lied to about the real reason for going to war, and so forth. And so maybe there's even more secrecy and less deliberation in the democratic setting in some cases because you don't speak the truth. I mean, the lead up to the Iraq War was a desire of a small group to have a war to overthrow Saddam Hussein on pretextual reasons that turned out to be completely false, maybe even more false than they believed. But certainly they were not very much interested in the evidence that they were purporting to give to the American people. So it was a deception. And because of the deception, I'm just wondering whether maybe the deliberation is even cut short in such contexts because too much talk, too much deliberation lets too much of the public in, and they didn't want to let the public in.
Yeah, let me directly address this issue, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about. First of all, in the book that Sebastian and I have written on how states think, what we discovered is that public opinion, what the public thinks, domestic politics, and so forth and so on, matters hardly at all in the decision-making process. The elites, a small number of elites, get together and they make the decision. We were actually surprised by this finding. We didn't go in thinking that this was a question we should address, how much domestic politics matters. But we discovered in looking at 14 cases and looking in a cursory way at a lot of other cases that domestic politics doesn't matter. That's point one. Point two is there's no
It's amazing. It's a stunning finding and a very important one.
Yes. And again, it wasn't one that we went in asking about, a question we went into the book asking about. Okay. Second point is that if you are in a democracy and you make a particular decision, you have to sell it to the public. There's no question about that. That's not as necessary in an autocracy. It's not to say it's completely unnecessary, because public opinion does matter somewhat, but it's definitely necessary in a democracy. Now, I wrote an earlier book called Why Leaders Lie. And the principal finding in that book is that leaders do not lie very much to other leaders, and they lie mainly to their publics.
Yep.
And you get more lying in democracies than in
Okay.
autocracies.
There you go.
There you go.
I believe that. I really believe that. And I think sometimes you just feel it's a nonstop narrative and deception. And you know, one of the senior people in the Biden administration on another issue, and I don't want to say who and what the context was, but I said, well, you know, have you weighed in on this? And they said no. You know, only the spin guys in the White House have any role in that right now. It's all about narrative, how you pitch it, not what the substance is. 'Cause this was, you know, is there really that deliberation over that particular issue? And there was very little, actually.
Yeah, it's, you know, when I wrote Why Leaders Lie, and I would go around the country and I would tell people that leaders do not lie much to each other. People found that hard to believe, right? And then when I said that leaders in democracies are especially prone to lying to their publics, people found that hard to believe. But I would just say to you, the reason that people in democracies or the people inside a country are easy to lie to is because those people tend to trust their government. Because after all, it is your government. You expect them to protect you. They're your leaders. So they're primed to be deceived. When you're dealing with foreign leaders, they don't trust each other to begin with. We don't trust Putin. Putin doesn't trust us. And this goes back to 2000 when he took power, right? It's not just now in 2023. So given that there's not much trust to begin with, you really can't get away with lying at the international level like you can at the domestic level.
Oh, that's really something. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and a few others decided they would overthrow the Syrian government in 2011. Typical regime change operation. That's what created the war and the refugees. Did any single European leader say that, explain that to the public? Not one. So then they wonder, why is their popularity so low? Well, if you don't speak up the truth, what do you expect? And so understand that these hegemonic wars of the United States, these are not in Europe's interests. And that's the same with supporting what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not a matter of right or left. It's a matter of what's Europe's interest right now. It is not to have a fulminant Middle East war right now.
So how do you create this miracle? Because even the possible alternative to Biden is Trump or somebody from the Republican. They are in certain aspects even more radical pro-Israeli than the Democrats. How to overcome this tiny problem?
Yes, so the pressure has to come from inside the United States and from outside. From inside, public opinion absolutely does not accept the administration line on this. This is very clear in opinion survey after opinion survey. So somebody in the White House concerned about Biden's reelection must be reading this and must be understanding this is just purely bad tactics from a U.S. political point of view. That's very important. There's lots of protest in the United States and lots of unhappiness with this. So we're not in any way locked in internally to the politics. It's bad for Biden. It's bad for U.S. interests. It's against public opinion. And so this is one point that I would make. It's not like the United States is rousing support, yes, and it's impossible to turn. It's actually deeply contested and mainly opposed. Though I acknowledge that in Washington, the pro-Israel lobby has always been very powerful. The military-industrial complex is very powerful, and the inertia is also powerful. So I'm not saying it's easy. Now, on the outside, the entire world is basically aligned on this side with one important footnote, which is that a few European countries maybe are not aligned. I don't know what the Austrian government's real position is. Sometimes it's don't side with the U.S., or maybe it really is because of more right-wing view or whatever, side with Israel, but it's very few. The problem in Europe is European politicians stopped telling the truth about almost anything years ago because all they want to do is side with the United States. And I think I would just say to European politicians, if you do it, you lose at the polls. There isn't a popular government in Europe right now because it's incredible. This is so much against Europe's own political interests. So I would say, think through this honestly, and then say, it's right. We're not against Israel. We just need to move to a two-state solution. And the United States, come over here, buddy. You know it too. Let's move to a real solution. I'm waiting for European politicians to regain 2 feet on the ground, their head out of the clouds or out of U.S. control, and just state clearly, straightforwardly what is right and also what happens to be in Europe's interest. But by the way, what happens to be in Israel's interest as well, because nothing that's happening is doing anything other than gravely threatening Israel's long-term survival. This messianism, this greater Israel idea, this zealotry of this religious group, this is not saving Israel. This is threatening Israel's survival. So I want European leaders just to think clearly and honestly about this, because that'll also help the United States get to the right place.
I think there is a lot to say about the European leaders. I think the European leaders, there are no leaders, you know it better. And there is another tiny problem. We will have also an election this year in some European countries, but in the European Union for the European Parliament. And the problem is that everybody, according to most of the polls, it's to foresee that the right-wing European nationalistic right-wing parties will win. And the problem is they are even, at least concerning Israel, they are also in the meantime, although many of their parties, if to go back history, you know where they come from. And this is a historic cynicism. I think that these right-wing fascist parties, now they are on side of Israel, which is unbelievable for anybody who knows history and who knows how things happened, that these parties, who are sometimes in internal issues, they are racistic, they are fascistoid right today, but when it comes to Israel, they are supporting the Jewish state.
Yeah, supporting the Jewish state is one thing. Supporting what is called Greater Israel to dominate the Palestinians is so senseless for Israel and for Europe that everybody should take a deep breath and understand that. How many self-wounds does Europe want? How many crises, how many wars does Europe want around it? And I would ask the European leaders, the reason why the right is growing is in part because the so-called center or center-left all was gung-ho with the United States for NATO enlargement and for the war in Ukraine. And of course, it's been a disaster for Europe. It's been a disaster economically for Europe. It's been a disaster from a security point of view for Europe. So it's not even left-right. It's a failure policy that the current European governments have pursued, and they are opening up their way for an opposition to arise. And that's what's happening, in fact. So the reason European politicians, by the way, across the board, you look at the approval ratings in Western Europe right now or in the EU, nobody has any support, basically, except the few that stand up for themselves, like Orban or Fico or a few others. But the ones that are basically just siding with the United States in this useless Ukraine war are all in their 20% approval ratings or 25% approval ratings and so on. So the main point I would say to Europe is, if you go the way, not of supporting Israel, that's one thing, but supporting greater Israel for ethnic cleansing and for this terrible thing, all you're doing is making another prolonged disaster on Europe's borders. And if that's in Europe's interest, boy, please explain it to me.
This is no doubt about it. I think Europe, I think with this policy they follow the last tens of years. I think it's against their own security, economic, even cultural interests. I think this is something which...
I'll give you another example, by the way. The politics of the 2010s was dominated by the Syrian refugees. And anyone that knows even the slightest history should understand that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and a few others decided they would overthrow the Syrian government in 2011, typical regime change operation. That's what created the war and the refugees. Did any single European leader say that? Explain that to the public? Not one. So then they wonder, why is their popularity so low? Well, if you don't speak up the truth, what do you expect? And so understand that these hegemonic wars of the United States, these are not in Europe's interests. And that's the same with supporting what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not a matter of right or left. It's a matter of what's Europe's interest right now. It is not to have a fulminant Middle East war right now. And so European politicians should think about how to diffuse a Mideast-wide war.
You are completely right. I think you convince people like me. Unfortunately, we are not in power. And but coming back to the issue of this interview, I think now there is a peace plan. It's even economically, we didn't even mention it, but which is interesting for me, since you're also long experienced in economy. I think one important but not so much debated proposal is the establishment of a new UN fund. A UN Reconstruction and Sustainable Development Fund, which is interesting, should at least partially funded by reduction of expenses which traditionally have been spent for armament and war.
Outside the UN, across the street from headquarters, is what they call Isaiah's Wall, which is the inscription of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, which says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not make war on other nations, neither will they teach war anymore. I'm paraphrasing, but, Isaiah had the idea in the 8th century BCE of the transforming the military to the civilian use. And we're now spending $2.5 trillion a year worldwide on the military. The United States is around 40% of the world's spending. Shocking, because we're 4% of the world's population. What if we take even 10% of that would be $200 billion a year. So $250 billion a year. And so that's the proposal. Create a fund funded by basically agreed cutbacks in armaments. I should mention that Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Populorum Progressio in 1967, had that idea. So I don't want to claim any precedence to this, but I do think it's the right idea. The UN in general does not command much in financial resources. It needs to have a bigger budget to do good things. And one way would be military cutbacks that are rechanneled to sustainable development.
We could continue hours and hours and hours, since many things have been already discussed for many years. But it's interesting that now this plan is here. I think, do you have any ideas how to make it even more popular? Do you intend to present it to other international bodies? And how should this come to reality?
I'm discussing these ideas with UN diplomats all the time. And I've discussed it with Palestinian diplomats and with diplomats from around the Middle East. There's a lot of resonance with this. I personally am continuing to urge an immediate membership of Palestine in the UN as a UN member state. By the way, Palestine is a state recognized by 140 other states, but it is not recognized as a UN member state, only an observer, as you rightly pointed out. So I am continuing my own discussion of this, basically with the U.S. government. They don't talk to me too much, but I try to make my views known publicly by writing and posting articles all the time. And I'm writing to politicians in the U.S. who are quite resistant in general, because their modus operandi for decades has been never show any space at all with Israel. But I'm telling them it's not working. It's not working from any point of view. You need to rethink this. So they have a few days of rethinking before the Congress comes back. The White House cannot be very comfortable. We hear lots of stories about pretty harsh talks between the U.S. and Israel right now. I believe that that's true. One of the U.S. carrier groups has been withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean and is on its way back to the U.S. That is a signal that the U.S. does not want a wider war in the Middle East. I think that's absolutely right. The U.S. is exhausted of war, and an election year, it would be the end of Biden's chances at all. So this is the time for pushing the politics, because it's a case where the right thing to do, the politically expedient thing to do are the same. And so I'm going to continue to push hard on that.
Do you have any hope in, I think you mentioned it and everybody knows it, I think 2/3 of the international states are in favor of this kind of political and economic solution. Unfortunately, they don't have any veto at the UN. But there is something else. There is an increasing number of states working together. I think, and the South African move to the International Court is interesting because South Africa, on the other side, is one of the leading member states of this newly established group, the BRICS group. And they have even already established a kind of new banking system, financing system. Do you have any indications or ideas that from this side, more than just political statements will come to support your suggestions?
Well, the BRICS countries, all of them are on the same side that I've been advocating. China, Russia, South Africa, India has expressed also some clarity on this. Brazil, certainly. And now you have new BRIC states that have just joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It's a powerful group. They're all on this side. Actually, it's interesting for me, the fact that Iran is now a BRICS member is actually going to moderate Iran, make it part of what could be a BRICS-wide consensus on a good solution. So this matters because the U.S. also looks out and says, you know, our diplomacy, we're isolated, whereas China's and Russia's diplomacy is growing in the region. This cannot make anyone happy. And we know that in the U.S. State Department, there's a lot of unhappiness about the U.S. administration policy. We don't hear all the details, but it boils over every few weeks. And so we hear about the protests coming from inside the professional diplomatic service of the United States as well. So I wouldn't give up in any way on a political change where the United States one day says, you know, we need to move forward to a real solution here. This is where I think it's very appropriate and timely to think straight. And if the European leaders are too afraid to say it in public, they should be saying it. They should be saying it in private to their American counterparts.
They should, yeah. So I think it's time. I think we exceeded a little bit our usual limit. So thank you very much, Professor Sachs. I think it was very interesting. It's important, and I think we should really invest more and more time to publish these ideas, and maybe even outside the usual normal circles we have in New York, in Brussels, because the world is much bigger and in the long run more or less more powerful than the world which runs the business till now, but it will come to an end. And the Palestinian-Israeli issue could be, we forgot something, because the Palestinian issue, what is it in history? It's a colonial problem. It's one of the last unsolved colonial problems, and it's more than 100 years after formally colonialism was ended. It's time to deal with the remaining rests, and Israel-Palestine is one, and this should be one of our ambitions to.
What happened to Western values? Because it's a very interesting and important and strange story in a way, and it's worth reflecting on. The values that we heard about both Buddhist and Confucian thought clearly find some resonance in Christian thought, especially in gospel teachings of Jesus, and also in Greek thought, because if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, as was seen, you would find some connections that are quite important, actually, and I want to draw them out. But then Western philosophy took an odd turn, or Western thinking took an odd turn, and it's important to understand that change of values that took place starting around 1500 to today, because there really was a change of the Western philosophical approach, and a divergence that is, I think, quite harmful in many ways. So if you look at Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, if I might, just very briefly, they're all in deep ways, not the same ways, but deep ways, variants of what can be called virtue ethics. The idea of virtue ethics is that human beings have the potential to do good, not the inevitability of doing good, and that virtues need to be cultivated to bring out the best in human beings. And this is a common idea of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius in the teachings. In Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path, there is the idea of the right view, the right action, the right speech, the right livelihood, and so on, as ways to cultivate the underlying virtues. Aristotle was very, very clear that happiness depends on virtue, but virtue must be cultivated. It cannot be taken for granted. And the main virtues in the Greek thought were virtues of what's called practical wisdom, or phronesis, which was the ability to choose the good over the enticing; temperance, which is moderation, which is a common virtue across all of these philosophies; bravery, which means the ability to defend the good; and justice, the ability to discern the right allocation for each person. And so those became the cardinal virtues in Western thought. But what was key for Aristotle was the idea that being virtuous is a potential of human beings, not an inevitability, because we are all bound by our bodily temptations, by our animal instincts, but also by our reason. So in Western Greek thought, reason was the predominant notion. This is not the same as in Eastern thought, but it comes to some similar points. And Aristotle said one must develop the habits of virtue. In fact, virtue or ethics comes from the word habit in Greek, that you practice, just as we heard, that you become altruistic by practicing altruistic acts. And Aristotle believed in mentorship, in education, in practice, in life experience as being vital. So here is a common basis that merges East and West virtue traditions at a quite deep level. And Christian thought, especially the teachings of Jesus himself as in the Gospels, are not the same basis. It's not exactly virtue ethics, but it is, of course, the virtues that are proposed, and especially also the Confucian golden rule is also Jesus's golden rule, although Jesus states it positively: do to others what you would have them do to you, and love thy neighbor as you love yourself. And that led in the early centuries of Christianity to a tremendous institutional focus of the bishops and the monasteries to care for the poor. And that was a real point, because the Christian communities, the emperors took care of their business, and the bishops took care of the poor in a division of responsibility that started around the 4th century AD in the West. Skipping ahead 1,000 years, philosophy changed starting around 1500 in a rather deep way. And while Aristotle taught, for example, that politics is a field of ethics, and Aristotle's book, The Politics, which is the first book of Western political thought, no, let me say it's the first book of Western political science is the better way to say it, because Plato had written the Republic a generation earlier. But it's the first book of political science. It is paired with his ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, as two joined volumes, because for Aristotle, ethics and politics were the same. Of course, in 1514, I think it is, Machiavelli wrote a very different political science. He wrote a handbook for the prince, which was about how to maintain power. And political science in the West began to be the science of maintaining or managing power, not the science of producing the good. And in fact, Machiavelli was teaching the prince. He was actually making a job application back to the Medicis because he had been dismissed from the Medicis, wanting a job back that he was advising the Medicis how to hold power in Florence. Later, in the next century, one of the most influential texts in Western cultural history was written by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. And this was written in 1640 as Western science was taking shape. And Hobbes wanted a scientific theory of human beings, but modeled as individual atoms that collide with each other. Because for Hobbes, there was no longer a cultivation of virtue, but rather each individual with insatiable desires. So Hobbes's model of human nature is that it is simply unbounded desire. It can't be taught to moderate desire. It can't be cultivated for virtue. It is individualistic and it is insatiable. And so Hobbes said, unless there is an overarching power, people will kill each other. And so we need a Leviathan, he said, to stop human nature from committing non-stop violence. It was a very pessimistic view of human nature, but notice the main point is no longer was there any idea of developing virtue. That was deemed to be impossible. Instead, one needed institutions to reflect harsh reality. This is the flip of philosophy. It's no longer about cultivating the good. It is about controlling the bad. Then interestingly and importantly, this was amplified at the beginning of the 18th century, first by a very influential public intellectual, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay in London called The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, the most aggressive bees win, but they make the hive powerful and great. And if you try to control the avarice or the vice or the aggression of the bees, the hive actually dies. So this was now a philosophy of empire, that power seeking was good because it would make the society powerful and wealthy and able to dominate over the other bees. So it was taking Hobbes and adding another element, one beehive taking dominance over others. And clearly this was a philosophy that appealed to the emerging British Empire. Then came Adam Smith 6 decades later in 1776, and he said, in agreement with Hobbes and in agreement with Mandeville, that human nature is individualistic, tastes are unbounded, desire is a great motivator, but market forces will tame all of that, because market forces will force a kind of competition that will lead to a socially beneficent outcome. The point is, the Anglo-Saxon philosophy broke free of more than 1,800 years of Western tradition. The Western tradition from Aristotle and Christianity was a tradition of the common good, virtue, and care for the poor. With the rise of the British Empire, the philosophy became the benefits of power as a philosophy. And then even the idea that this would lead to, quote, the common good. But there are two more steps that are important to state. The poor became an enemy because now they were a drag on society. So John Locke, one of our most esteemed philosophers, wanted very harsh treatment for the poor so that they would not be burdens on society. And then came Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote after Adam Smith, one generation later in 1798. And he proposed something even darker, which is that those hives, those different societies, are actually in competition for survival with each other, because there are more people produced than can be supported. And so life is a battle for survival, and trying to help the poor is inevitably to fail, because there will just be more poor people. That was his iron law of population. And that led in the next step. Darwin took that idea brilliantly from a scientific point of view to understand natural selection. But the later 19th century philosophers took that idea as a struggle across nations, and that now nations or peoples or races were in the struggle for survival. And this became known as social Darwinism. And the idea was, not only should there be no beneficence, if you help your own poor, you will weaken your society compared to others, and indeed you're in a struggle for survival. And this gave rise to the worst crimes of history, because Nazism actually, as a philosophy, which it was based on social Darwinist pseudoscience. And this idea, the German people will survive or the Slavic people will survive. And so this is a war even to extermination. Now, this kind of idea led to the worst cruelties, but we are still in a mindset in the Western world where it is competition and struggle that is the absolute underpinning of society. When I studied economics, I was taught about perfect competition. I was never taught even 1 minute about perfect cooperation. The idea doesn't even exist in economics. It's not even developed in one paper that I know of, because the idea of cooperation as a norm doesn't exist. It happened, this notion of letting greed motivate action perhaps did generate the spirit of innovation to some extent. But the way that it was championed and taught, of course, led to the worst excesses. So the world became rich, and those who were rich became devoid of benevolence and compassion. And a terrible writer in the United States who became quite popular, Ayn Rand, a kind of popular philosopher among young people and among many politicians, wrote a famous essay about the virtues of selfishness. So selfishness became the virtue, actually. That's the literal title of an essay. It's unbelievable, and she is championed by many still. These novels are unbearable to read, but they are part of our philosophy. So I went on too long, I know, because the sign told me to stop 5 minutes ago. But so that's not very benevolent of me. But let me say the following. I believe we've had a deviation from the right path in Western civilization. There are roots of Western culture that we can really use to find a path of virtue and politics that is ethical. But the Anglo-Saxon version deeply lost this tradition. And there are many fascinating reasons for this, but it was mainly the rise of power of the British Empire, which was in many ways an extremely nasty empire. And the United States learned everything it knows from the British Empire because it aims to be the continuation of the British Empire after World War II. And this is what needs to end, a world that can return to the common ethical principles of virtue. Now, let me just conclude by saying I am hopeful that this can actually happen. And I think you at the table need to help lead that. And we need to help explain these things. And when President Xi Jinping launched last year the Global Civilizations Initiative, I think that this is actually an important opening that is very positive, because China has said we should go back to our roots of culture to find a way forward, which I very much subscribe to. And the GCI, or Global Civilizations Initiative, is an invitation across civilizational wisdom. And I hosted a meeting in Athens last month, co-hosted with the Academy of Athens, a Aristotle-Confucius symposium on ancient wisdom for modern challenges that brought together Chinese and Western philosophers. We didn't have Buddha properly at the table except one very distinguished Buddhist thinker from Cambodia, but we need more of that. At the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would have a second symposium. This time, I hope it is the Aristotle-Buddha-Confucius Symposium in Shufu, in Shandong province in July. I hope we could participate together in that. We will be back for that. Many philosophers are interested in that. I will be in Shufu in next month for the Nishan Forum, which is also a philosophical forum, but the Shandong government has asked to host the follow-up meeting of the Aristotle-Buddha-Confucius Symposium. And I believe that this idea of East and West deep philosophical traditions finding the deep humanity that is common across them is extremely important and powerful and can really contribute to an understanding which right now doesn't exist. And I think the failings of this understanding are overwhelmingly on the Western side, if I may say so, because we are steeped in a philosophy of competition and even war. And this mindset is taken as given, but it is actually a recent phenomenon. It is an imperial phenomenon, and it needs to be put aside. So I believe that this actually can be done. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because I want to talk about net zero by 2050. And first to say how much I admire what Dr. Shaw proposed, and is the book in English also, or in Chinese? Okay, we're going to have to get me an English translation somehow, if we can, but I'm very eager also to read your forthcoming paper. Let me add a couple of things that I think are central, but I think they're already exactly in your climate club idea. It is not possible to reach net zero one country at a time, least of all for an island. We need an interconnected energy system, region by region, because if you are tapping renewable energy, it's intermittent. So it's sunny here or windy here. This needs interconnection. And East Asia should be interconnected in a common grid. There is a mainland China program called GuideCo, Development Cooperation Organization, that is the China State Grid engineers who are doing analytical work on interconnecting regional grids for Africa, for South America, for North America, for Europe, and for Asia. This is very important work. Taiwan should be connected to the mainland in a power grid. And the mainland should be connected with Mongolia, and it should be connected with the ASEAN countries, and with submarine system. It would be region, the economic powerhouse of the world, rather than a battleground, because this region has everything if it works together. And it could lose everything if it views the region as a battleground. I think everyone in this region can understand this. The only one that does not is my country, actually. But the U.S. needs to be told, let us solve our problems. We know how to discuss. Don't meddle, because you will make a mess. This is actually the truth. This is true about Japan. It's true of zero carbon energy and all the cooperation that would the regional cooperation, the regional structure, and and probably roadmaps that show the physical interconnectedness, what technologies, where, as I've been saying, opposite of a plan. It's 80% fossil fuel. What plan is that? Nothing. Please, don't encourage them. So show fantastic work. Sonia and I were just in Beijing with them a couple of days ago. We'll come back for a meeting that they're hosting on September 26th for a worldwide meeting on energy interconnections. I think that this is really absolutely at the core. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's absolutely the way forward. And in that polycentric world, there's a concept which I find very useful. It's a concept adopted by the European Union, but a concept that actually started with the Roman Catholic Church, and that is the concept of subsidiarity, which is that we need governance at all levels. So we need global governance, regional governance, national governance, local governance. You put each problem at the lowest level possible, closest to the people, where it can be solved, but not below the level at which it can be solved. So the power grid cannot be solved at the national level. It must be solved at the regional level. The targets for decarbonization must be solved at the global level, and so forth. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we have this multiple levels. We have global governance. We have a global government that can do certain things and not other things. We have regional government. We have national government. We have local.
Is there any hope that the U.S. and Ukraine are going to be trying to negotiate for some sort of peace agreement with Russia?
This is, Kim, not unlike the virus story in that the government lies relentlessly about why we are in this war, what's happening in the war, and therefore what is going to happen. The biggest lie is where this war came from. And I have a view that is deeply founded, I'm going to say, because I know a lot about this over the past 30 years. This is a war, in my view, that arose because the U.S. rather pig-headedly, in other words, relentlessly, stubbornly insisted on pushing NATO farther to the east every step of the way. And the Russians kept saying, don't expand NATO towards us. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that to Ukraine. We don't want your military on our border. Do you get it? And the United States said, what? We don't hear you. No, don't worry. We're peace-loving. We love you. We want to destroy you. We want to decolonize you. We want to break you up. We want to do all sorts. But we love you. And we never go to war except in bombing Belgrade for 7 straight weeks. And oh, yeah, and Afghanistan we occupied for 15 years as NATO. And the Iraq War was unprovoked. And yeah, we tried to overthrow your ally Assad with the CIA regime change operation. And oh, yeah, NATO took out Gaddafi. And yeah, we are placing missiles nearby you in Poland and Romania because we unilaterally abandon the anti-ballistic missile treaty, but we're peace-loving, and of course we're going to move NATO right up to your 2,300-kilometer border, and not just in Ukraine, but we're going to do it in Georgia. Fascinating, by the way. People, please take out a map and look up Georgia, not the one next to Florida, but Georgia in the Black Sea, on the eastern boundary of the Black Sea, because that country is not a North Atlantic country. So why would it ever be in NATO? And yet the United States wants to push NATO to Georgia. And if you look at a map, I can explain in 30 seconds why that is, because the intention of the United States is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia creates an encirclement. And Russia's naval fleet, the Black Sea Warm Water Naval Fleet, is in Sevastopol, Crimea. And it's been there, by the way, since 1783. And there was already one major war in the 19th century between 1853 and 1856, where the British had the idea, get rid of that naval fleet. And in the late 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the same idea of surround Russia by getting Ukraine into the Western camp and actually into NATO. And then Russia ceases to be a major power, is their theory. Well, to make a long story short, this is the major reason for this war, and we've never been told the truth about it. And that is really devastating. Second, closely related issue is that in February 2014, the US conspired to overthrow the government of Ukraine. And it did so. That's not a good move. If you're trying to push NATO and there's a president named Viktor Yanukovych who wanted neutrality, and you get together with forces inside the country and you support the overthrow of Yanukovych, the violent overthrow, not a good look. That's when this war started in February 2014. And then if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening repeated mantra of the US government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then, it started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the US poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing, because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, have been part of this story since 2014. And really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well, because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Nuland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the US pushed the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Nuland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney Bush days, and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the US government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that and said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, oh, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliance is? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the U.S. leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you know, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of NATO himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying, and yeah, NATO has nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia and the rest of Ukraine, and you know, then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. They've cut them off from the Baltic Sea with Finland.
These are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game?
Yeah.
It was a board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing can stop us. We take over all of North America, Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads. And they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me. But the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
Well, let me just say the kinds of things that should be done, in my opinion, are things like the Belt and Road Initiative of China, because the Chinese government recognized that for China's own well-being, but also the well-being of its neighbors, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth, and countries even farther afield, all economies need modern infrastructure. And modern infrastructure means access to high quality electricity, especially zero carbon energy now, to fast rail, to fiber, 5G networks, and so forth. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is in its 10th year, uses especially finance from China, from the China Development Bank and other institutions, to help finance the spread of infrastructure across Eurasia and across the sea routes, also connecting Africa and South America and East Asia. So that's a very good example. It's pragmatic, it's investment oriented. It doesn't just talk the talk, it actually provides the financing and provides the technology. I wish the rich countries in the West were doing this. They are the former colonial powers. They behaved badly when they were the colonial powers, and they're not behaving very well as the post-colonial powers. Right. They're not really stepping up to their responsibility.
Right, because I was just in China like for 2 months, and I think it really strengthens of carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutralization by 2050. But I feel like the United States haven't done enough of promoting this ideology of carbon neutrality. So how, as citizens ourselves, can push for those changes?
It's interesting. In the United States, most people know that climate change is a very serious crisis, and we just had the devastating fires in Hawaii to show how tragic this climate change is. We're in the hottest period in not only recorded history, but in human history for the last 125,000 years. The month of July was probably the single hottest month ever that humanity has experienced. Certainly that's true during the period of recorded temperatures. So we should be doing much more. And the American people know this. And certain things are happening, of course. There's investment in green energy. in a lot of places. There's investment in the conversion of the auto industry to electric vehicles, which is part of the solution. But at the national level, there was a piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very strange name for legislation, which is mainly centered on the energy transformation. And it gives tax breaks for green energy. But what it doesn't do is make a national plan. There is no national plan. It doesn't make a national plan because in American politics, the power of the fossil fuel lobby, big oil and big coal, is so strong that politicians don't tell the truth to their own constituents, and they act on behalf of their lobbies who pay for their campaigns rather than on behalf of the American people. In the United States Senate, in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the chairman, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is notorious for being the front for the big oil lobby. And he himself has family wealth tied up in 2 coal companies. So I regard that as corruption, but in the American system, it's legal corruption, or seems to be legal, but it's corruption nonetheless. If you're told that in a country that hasn't taken a clear plan for decarbonization has senior officials who own coal companies, you'd say, well, of course, that's just political corruption. But unfortunately, that's how the United States works. So the American people are saying more and more, we're disgusted with the political system. It's all about money. It's all about the reelection of these corrupt politicians. And I think that the more we clarify how broken this is, the farther we're going to get. But of course, at substantive levels, we need a plan of action to decarbonize by 2050 that is not only at the state level, because many states have such plans taking shape, but at the federal level. And one of the main lessons of what's happening right now is that there are more projects in more projects in wind and solar than can be put onto the grid, because the real breakdown is the transmission system. But that's where federal investment and a federal plan is needed. And we don't have that because of all the political problems that I talked about.
And I think that America's structure is so like money-based, money-focused, that it comes before the mutual benefits that all the human can get.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
it's not based on the common good. It's based on the special interest.
Right. It's always money, money, money. And then I want to touch on this, is that we all know that Japanese is going to have a nuclear wastewater dumps. So what are some actions that United Nations would do to counter this type of behavior?
Well, on the specifics on Japan, I can't really comment because I haven't studied the scientific arguments on both sides. And in general, on technical arguments, I tend to listen to the range of experts and ask their opinion. So I would think at a minimum what the UN should be doing, and maybe it is, and I'm just not involved at all in it, is looking at through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is based in Vienna, at this question of the wastewater from Fukushima and what should be done about it, because that's a technical issue that should not be any individual government's authority. The UN should weigh in, especially at the technical level. But in general, we have some pretty clear needs that are urgent, whether it's the decarbonization or protecting the ecosystems from pollution or from over harvesting or from waste. And we need technical plans of action. But that planning mechanism is hard work. And it's hard work for the political reason of keeping it free from corruption. and it's hard work at the technical level because a lot of technical issues are raised. And so countries need effective planning ministries. China has the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, which does a lot of the technical planning. And the United States doesn't have a planning ministry. So we don't make plans because we don't have a ministry of planning or a ministry of economy or a planning agency. In the US lexicon, planning is a bad idea. But, you know, for certain things, I am happy that planning is done within private businesses, but for other things, I want the planning to be done by government. And in every sphere of the economy, planning is essential. It's just that sometimes it's not a government function, sometimes it's a private sector function.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the United States government needs to go through a really big structural change. And in that, I think the driving forces are the Gen Z and Gen Alpha people coming up. But right now, I think we lack guidance. So what are some advices that you would guide, like some advices that you would give us to start with?
Well, that's a really very interesting and deep question, because let me just say that our Constitution was drafted in 1787. Of course, it's had some amendments since then, but basically it's the same structure that was decided in 1787. And it's out of date. It doesn't have the substantive principles that are needed for the modern period, and it does not enable the strong planning or environmental protection or assurance of economic rights for the people. So it's really an out-of-date structure in many, many ways. At the same time, it has been deeply damaged by corruption, by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the US system, because otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And yeah, I think currently another problem with the US is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. Like the counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States.
So, excellent point. Basically, there are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States, because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide. They want their benefits without saying, you see, I run the government. So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually. And so it takes some effort, but as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University working together, discussing. and so forth. Somehow making such projects, both the economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather than to really educate them.
Yeah, and the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight, because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future, and we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. Don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world.